We've kind of been around the block when it comes to movie content over the years. Somehow, I've been doing this for 4.5 years just on the movie sphere, and after dissecting ideas for content in all sorts of different series and playlists, sometimes series start to come to a close. And one of the very largest playlists we've run with that's very much reaching the end of its lifespan, we have the cancelled series. And as of now, we have covered around about 30 cancelled productions. Typically, in the early days of this playlist, I went through the ones that actually had genuine footage and concept art to bounce off of, and of course the most production news and stories around why these movies were cancelled in the first place. And though the cancelled series is still around, the actual depth of some of the more later projects are a little more vague, or you just have to wait till new ones come out. So I decided let's do a sort of wrap up of all of the cancelled movies we covered, as we're now going to rank from worst to best all of the cancelled movies, or at least the biggest ones that are worth mentioning. Which of these movies are a genuine disaster to have never made it into the full screen in full animated form, which had the best premises but maybe were a little bit rocky, and which ones were cancelled and maybe very much deserved it. Here is my very objective personal opinion, a ranking of animated cancelled movies. Starting off at the very bottom, we have Yellow Submarine. Now to me, this movie is just nightmare fuel. This was a Beatles movie based off of the original Yellow Submarine movie, which in its own right is just a massive cartoon fever dream, but to see it revitalized in 3D, kind of weird. To revitalize it with Robert Zemeckis' studio, Image Movers, in 3D, and oh my god, why did the Beatles allow this? I mean, I guess it partially makes sense. 2 of them are dead. But though there is some very interesting concept art for the weird architectural designs behind this movie, I also don't think there's very much demand for it, and Jesus Christ, I still see that one purple abomination that haunts me when I get sleep paralysis. I think for my own mental well-being and the fact that this was going to come out when I was still a child, I'm very glad this one didn't make it to the end. Following that, we have Cat Tail. Now, to be honest, this just doesn't seem that appealing to me. This looks like the generic kind of cat movie that you could easily merge into a million other things that did get made. It's a little ugly, it's a little boring, it's a little, do we really need it? In a time where furry movies are nowhere near unpopular, I mean, both Disney and Illumination have made their own variants, we don't need what, to me, kind of feels like My Sims done with cats made in any form. In fact, I covered this relatively recently. It was towards the late to mid-end of cancelled productions on this series, and yet I don't actually remember any of the real details towards it. It doesn't help that there wasn't that much information to really go off of, and honestly, I was scraping the barrel at the time I was talking about Cat Tail. Do you care about Cat Tail? I doubt it. So following a little bit ahead of that, with one that does at least have some iconography to it, we have the Duke Nukem movie. This, I mean, in concept, that sounds brilliant. Duke Nukem is quite a fantastical IP in that I think there is a lot of very passionate people that are a fan of Duke Nukem. I'm only really familiar with it with the terrible Xbox 360 game they brought out that was weirdly blue the whole time. And the idea of actually a over-the-top American superpowered human defeating aliens left, right, and center sounds like a brilliant premise to run with, especially when you consider the Doom series is still going well and strong. We love that over-the-top hero vibes. Maybe it's a little bit 80s with the vibes of Terminator and Rambo, but maybe it'd be nice to get a modern version of that. The downside comes from the fact that this is not a modern story. This is by no means a modern character, and considering that this movie was one that was very much aiming for the early 2000s era, I think there are several Duke Nukem movies and they kept retrying over the years. Especially for that time period, we did not need there to be a Duke Nukem movie, because my god, that is not politically correct. Whilst at the same time, perhaps making Duke Nukem politically correct would then lose something of the magic of the core themes of the movie. It's an awkward conversation, considering that original Xbox 360 game, I remember, starts off with Duke Nukem playing his own game and then twins appear from his crotch area. I could see no rendition where this movie comes out tastefully. We love the quotes when it comes to doing brutal, horrendous things to the corpses of aliens just to say, hey yeah, America. But with a lot of these sexist tones that are intrinsically attached to Duke Nukem as a character, we don't need that to see the full output, especially in a decade like the 2020s these days. The only way you can get around it is if it's a comedy, laughing at Duke Nukem for being so out of touch and outdated, but even then, that's not really what you want out of a Duke Nukem movie, is it? Fun to think about. I think so far, these last 3 cancelled movies would be great if we could reach parallel universes just to witness what they're like. Be like, wow, that's funny. God, that's weird. That's a little cringy. Let's go back to our universe, please. You know what I mean? So following that, we have The Croods movie. Yeah, this movie didn't come out. If you thought that you've seen The Croods movie, you're wrong. It was in fact cancelled. Or at least, the original rendition of The Croods was cancelled, as it was originally going to be an Aardman production, not DreamWorks. Having, of course, a lot of parallels with the Croods movie that we did, in fact, see, with, of course, it being set in the Stone Age and being all about cavemen, the original Aardman idea was more so about Roald Dahl's The Twits just being done in the Stone Age instead, being called Crude Awakening, which suddenly makes a lot more sense for a name like Croods. This is just a parallel version of a story that we have actually seen. And though it does have a lot of interesting elements to it, like the fact that John Cleese was attached to write for this movie, it was inevitably split apart when Aardman and DreamWorks split apart during this era of the mid-2000s. So much for the 5-picture deal that the two had. Flushed away, causes issues. And similarly, I don't really think it's a cancelled movie that I want to see. Again, maybe as a parallel universe, I'm running with this plotline now to see what it could have been, but we don't really need it in our actual timeline because we already got The Croods, a version of The Croods. Do you care that much about the Twits in Stone Age? We've got Twits at Home on Netflix now. Well, soon enough we do anyway. And considering the actual The Croods got a 72 and 77% on Rotten Tomatoes, clearly it's a decent enough movie. Don't worry about it, it's fine. Now, this whole next era of cancelled movies is essentially going to be the same type of phase whereby we already have the real movie, so you don't need the cancelled rendition instead. It doesn't cover everything in this phase, and there are of course some outliers, but the next one on the list is the cancelled Toy Story sequel. Now, this is attached to the Disney Toon Studios production team, as this was again in the mid-2000s, whereby there was a phase of Disney being more intermixed with Pixar, wanting to take some of Pixar's IPs and making these spin-off series and sequels in a way that's not done by the core Pixar team, and ultimately didn't get made. In this rendition, the Toy Story sequel we're talking about replaces Toy Story 3, as that movie came out in 2010. This is before 2010. Now, what at least was fascinating for the cancelled episode is we practically know the entire plotline, with most of the screenplay being leaked to some degree, as well as a bajillion pieces of storyboard shots enabled to piece the story together. And there are some interesting elements, like there are all sorts of puns around different toys that wouldn't end up being in the actual Toy Story saga. So in a sense, you can take it as a micro headcanon that maybe that's how this works in this world, like a pack of cards. At the same time, not made by the Pixar people, so maybe it's completely an offshoot. The one thing I really do remember about this new screenplay, and honestly it was something I did get criticized for at the time, is pointing out that there were some slightly more outdated jokes in the formatting of this new story. There's a point where Woody does a cringe Chinese accent, and the point is that it's cringe and really lame to do, but it's still, it's not my Toy Story. The very fact that it's not made by Pixar means it's not going to have that exact same element of polish, and there were a lot more adult jokes in this Toy Story spin-off that, again, would be interesting to see, but we've got a damn good Toy Story at home instead, You cannot replace Toy Story 3. It's the best one of the 4. Now, the initial idea for the Shrek 1 movie, of course, comes with a little bit more of a bittersweet taste. However, I still think it makes sense, and everyone would probably agree that we don't necessarily need the original Shrek 1 tale from the 90s, as the 2001 rendition with Mike Myers is absolutely golden. I can't believe the fact that Shrek memes only really popped off after Shrek is Love, Shrek is Life. That is crazy to have learned recently. But still, this is an incredibly interesting project to see how it could have gone. I'm at most motivated to have maybe seen this version of the film just to see the success of its initially intended protagonist, Chris Farley, as it is well known that they were quite disappointed with their career path up to that point, and honestly, it's quite a sad tale that they died before the production finished and it really took off and went anywhere. It's interesting to know whether Shrek would have had the same impact in this original form, but it had obviously a lot of the same story elements. Would we memify the hell out of it, or would it have been even more buried under the weight that is 1995's Toy Story 1 and the push for 3D animation from here? Who knows? It's an interesting thought piece, but nonetheless, we have Shrek at home, and my god, is he never gonna leave our internet screens again. And then you've got Disney's My Peoples. which would have had Dolly Parton as the starring role. Set in the 1940s, the plotline was about how a ghost and 3 children want to bring a pair of lovers from 2 opposing families together. A kind of strange Romeo and Juliet-esque story that was ultimately replaced during production by Chicken Little, as this was right during the hand-drawn 3D CGI debate of Disney. Now, while I think there could be all sort of criticisms you could make about the plotline, a 1940s story isn't always the most interesting, and there does seem to be a lot of marketing issues to try and sell this idea. It's a little bit vague looking on the imagery and maybe a little bit boring with some of its color palette choices, but I also think it could have been a very interesting spin for Disney. Imagine if they did push out one more good hand-drawn animation production. I think maybe in this case it wouldn't have worked anyway, so maybe it's for the best, but considering the thing that came back instead was Chicken Little, I think I prefer anything over Chicken Little, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's kind of a tragedy, more so in the fact that it was replaced by something so bad instead of being its own glowing centerpiece of core heart, passion, and attention that we'll get to later in this list. Nonetheless, it's an alternative for Disney, and would have been very interesting to see nonetheless. Following that, we have the Sonic movies. Now, of course, we already have the live-action CGI Sonic movies in the 2020s, but back during the late 90s and early 2010s, there were several attempts at Sonic movies, and I'm going to bunch all of these together because they kind of have the same rating to me. In a sense, I think I am okay with them not existing, simply for the fact that they didn't negatively impact the brand. The fact that Sonic movies waited so long to make a movie that they were at a point where they could really master the output makes me think I'm kind of glad with the trajectory that the franchise actually got. We got some nice cartoons on the side. I'm a big fan of Sonic X personally. And though these stories sound interesting, like the idea of a kid being pulled into a television into the world of Sonic, and something about Sonic on a roller coaster, gosh, when you just read so many vague story plots, they do kind of merge into one and get a little confused over the times, but hey, that's why I've got the playlist. Those are eternal, you can watch those, and maybe I should as well. They all sounded like incredibly 90s style Sonic movies, and then there was the one made by Ken Penders, which is nightmare fuel again to see in its own right. That one can very much be at the bottom of the pack. Although actually, I guess maybe it could be at the top of the pack. I would have been really curious to see how that turned out. Sonic's gone through all sorts of identity crises enough on the gaming sphere. It's very nice we didn't get them on the movie sphere, but it'd be interesting to have seen on the side, sure. Now this next one I'm going to keep very quick. The cancelled Peanuts sequel. There is now an actual Peanuts sequel, and also the last time I spoke about it, I got a full-on copyright strike from the studio that now handles the rights for Peanuts movie, so I literally can't show you anything for this. Peanuts 2 goes here. What an interesting idea that film could have been. Gosh, I need to re-upload that cancelled episode because it took down Plants vs. Zombies and Shrek 1 down with it. Following that is a cancelled episode that's really near and dear to my heart, as I believe this was the very first one I made. There's something special about your first child, I think, and trying to breach into new territories, admittedly more on the gaming sphere back then, was very interesting to see. I'm now talking about the Portal movie, which I, just outright, would have really loved to see. I'm quite hyped for the idea of Portal as a universe, and adapting it to the screen in any form, series or movie, is just fun. Of course, at the time of this movie being considered, we weren't exactly at the best stage of gaming adaptations. Nowadays, yeah, pretty damn good. Would Valve make a Portal movie on HBO Max? I have no idea. I don't think they have any interest in doing adaptations yet, but everyone else certainly is doing it, so maybe it's plausible. Either way, back then it was going to very much be a focus on Chell as a character, and would have been a very interesting artsy piece for the simple fact that she's already a mute protagonist. And we haven't really played around much with adaptations of mute protagonists. The best we've got is the upcoming Nintendo Zelda production, and even then, I bet he's just gonna start speaking anyway. Very interesting in concept, this movie. I adore the Portal franchise. Having done 2 Let's Plays on the 2 games that I tried to make like the definitive edition, I'd memorized every single line and joke in Portal 2 that I would then try and bounce off additional comedic lines that timed between the dialogue of Portal 2, and I played Portal 1 and showcased all of the ASCII file hints with the radio. I had a great time at Portal, would have loved to have seen it, but maybe not the actual project because it wasn't exactly the best time. I'll just resort to YouTube Shorts instead. Those are just mwah when it comes to atmosphere. Following that, accidentally keeping in the same vibe of video game adaptations, but being a mix of the 2 reasonings for why I'm kind of interested in this, but not too badly, we have the Cuphead show. Now, the Cuphead show both already exists, and also I don't think we need it anymore. Running on Netflix for 3 whole seasons, this seemed like a pretty decent cartoon. I watched Some of it was alright, it wasn't crazy, but it was fun, and there was clearly a rabid fan base behind it. The thing that makes this so saddening is the fact that it just stopped being renewed. In fact, it never got renewed in the first place. I believe it was that when it was first created, it was given a deal of 3 seasons to run with, and then against all of those years, pumping them out every 6 months, I believe, they just never pushed any further. And that is a real shame, because it is a pretty damn good video game series adaptation, and arguably with some of the early day stuff, one of the first to really work it out. But alas, the lack of a season 4, to me, isn't the end of the world. Not only because there already is the first 3 seasons available to witness, and I assume Netflix isn't removing access to them, but also the fact that actually the finale to season 3, albeit a little bit vague, does have a ending to the series, as they end by going into a casino and then stopping there, as if to say, hey, then the game takes place. Where do they start? The opening scene in the casino. It's a full circle. It's vague in order to open up to maybe a season 4, but there is an ending you can stitch together. It's not as satisfying, but you've already got 3 seasons, and it's a damn good visual feast nonetheless. Now, Madagascar 4 is a real heartthrob. As I've grown up, I've come to really enjoy the comedic style of the Madagascar series. I watched the first movie in cinemas as a kid and, enjoyed it, but as someone who's really a big fan of that sort of cartoony slapstick humor, seeing how well they mastered it in the likes of the Penguins of Madagascar movie, I just kind of would love to have had more of it. Now, the Madagascar series has also gone on a long time. There are several long-running series when it comes to Madagascar. Maybe we'll cover it in an unwatched episode one day. And we do already have 3 mainline movies and a 4th as a spin-off, but I also just really enjoy the world of Madagascar, and clearly so do a lot of other people. I don't think Madagascar is quite as highly regarded as the likes of Shrek or How to Train Your Dragon or Kung Fu Panda either, but there is a real solid fan base for people that just love that kind of stupid humor. Silly. I'd call it silly humor, not necessarily stupid. Stupid is where fart jokes go, silly is where slapstick goes. Does that sound like a right sense? But alas, it never got made, and the series may have a revival in some form, but otherwise it's been laid to rest. We do like original stories anyway. Let's see what DreamWorks has next cooking up. Now, speaking of DreamWorks movies, another one that's even more, I would say, a harder hit to learning is cancelled is the Larrykins movie. Now, this is another video I made that has since been copyright taken down. Not quite a strike, so I'm not too angry about that. But either way, with it being a 2016, 17, 18 era movie, it's both a pretty modern day cancellation and also 5 to 7 years back on the other side of the pandemic. Even still, one of the things I really liked about this movie is the fact that it was entirely Australian focused. It's about these vague Australian animals, and though there are all sorts of animal stories before, seeing an actual Australian production, of course, would have done great for representation and showcasing a whole new cast and crew that otherwise might not get the same platforming as a mainline Hollywood popularity, or eyes on it at least, as much as it's also a DreamWorks production. Now, I'm going to be careful on this and just show you imagery and screenshots rather than actual footage, and this was one of many movies that were cancelled due to just corporate shufflings, especially from DreamWorks and Universal Pictures as they acquired them in 2016-17. But still, a great shame and a great loss considering it could have done great for representation. Thankfully, Australia have all sorts of productions they're now running, maybe on a slightly smaller platform. Their voices now, 7 years later, are getting out there piece by piece. It's a shame it didn't happen earlier, but this is as good as it gets. Up next, we have the next Disney Toon Studios production, as Finding Nemo as well was going to get a sequel. Not, of course, being the Finding Dory project that we did actually get. This would have been, again, the weird spin-off sequel idea that was in mind. And honestly, the thing about this production I remember the most is the effort that was put in to make the thumbnail for that video. As it turns out, yes, there was a brother figure involved. A secret surviving brother to Nemo was going to appear, and his name was Remy. I guess this must have been before Ratatouille 2, because obviously that name did get around somehow in some studio sister production. Beyond that, it seemed to have a very intriguing story. I think it could be arguable whether it was better than the Finding Dory production that we actually got, as obviously the actual mainline Pixar sequels that we do end up going, they're not always the quality of Toy Story 3. I think this would have been, once again, an interesting parallel to have seen, and I do adore the Finding Nemo universe. Hey, it's another Australian movie if you want to think about it that way, I guess. But at the same time, God, it would have been weird that there was a eye patch wearing brother to Nemo that was going to appear and other stuff happen. What a story, what a spin-off. We don't necessarily need it, and maybe it's not quite as culturally as important as the likes of a Larrykins or Cuphead revival, but it holds nearer and dearer to my heart. Moving on, we have Treasure Planet 2. Now this is just a real classic sad tale, honestly. The initial Treasure Planet is of course a fantastic movie that has a real cult following behind it, but the fact of the matter is, it was a box office flop. The audience just isn't there in the same way at the time, so it never exposed itself into a franchise. The way that it blended 3D animation and 2D animation was really quite ahead of its time, considering this was Disney trying its best in the hybrid form, and the fact that it didn't go anywhere is a real shame, because I feel like this could have been a real timeline structure change at this point. It's got incredible characters with one of the best father figures in animation, I think you could kind of argue, brilliant artistic prowess along the board, and of course there was a sequel in mind as well. This time involving Jim Hawkins and Kate, his love interest and classmate at the Royal Interstellar Academy, joining up with Long John Silver to stop the villainous Ironbeard. A classic pirate's tale that really sparks the imagination of the mind. We love space pirates, you know what I mean? Now since then, apparently the director has been about on Reddit asking a bunch of questions, which is very interesting. Great source of resource if you're interested in learning more. But really, from just the imagery alone, you could just expect it to be Treasure Planet, but more of. Although do take this with a grain of salt, and this was also set to be a direct-to-home video movie, so maybe we didn't really need it in the end anyway. It might be nice in concept and better in our brains, but the actual outcome, you know, it might not always be Lilo and Stitch 2. Sometimes it might just be Aladdin 2. When it comes to Disney sequels, it's very much hit or miss, but to have any new content with a fan base as rabid and invested as the Treasure Planet fan base, yeah, it's a real fumble that it didn't get made. Following that, and back to Disney again, we now have the Gigantic story. Now this, I'll be honest, I'm quite surprised didn't end up being made, as this was obviously a classic fairy tale, again for Disney to adapt, that just didn't get made in the end. Gigantic, of course, was going to be kind of based on that Jack and the Beanstalk-esque vibe, and this would have been taking place after the likes of Tangled. It was a real recent thing. However, it was Frozen and Frozen 2 that really killed this movie, I guess as Disney were taking their direction of how to market the same damn things again and again, off on their own things. They wanted to spin off and sequel the things they already had with the likes of Frozen and Frozen 2, rather than still going back to the 100-years-old stories of the old fairy tales. And I think that's kind of disappointing. I kind of think I would have preferred if Disney did both. Now that we're in the wake of Frozen 3 and Frozen 4 in production, and of course on the Pixar side, they have already made Toy Story 4, Lightyear, and Toy Story 5, you know, I kind of would have preferred it if it would have felt more diverse and interesting and maybe a little bit more solid if they did multiple of everything. And I don't mean to say overwork everybody, but I don't know, I think we would prefer a Disney schedule that's, here's an original, here's an old school fairy tale adaptation, here's the sequel to that original, here's another adaptation of an old fairy tale. I don't know, I think there's something to be lost from that. And honestly as well, Tangled was bloody brilliant. To choose between Tangled and then the spiritual successor Gigantic, with it having the same director, and then turning to Frozen instead, you know, it's a notable quality decline on the Disney side of things, but of course the decline in quality is massive stonks when it comes to monetization, so I guess that makes sense. Raya and the Last Dragon replaced what the initial slot of Gigantic was going to be. What a shame. I would have really liked to have seen it. And considering the concept art as well is pretty 2D, that would have been fascinating as well, as much as I don't think it was actually going to be 2D. But hey, at least we've now got the franchising of live-action remakes. Woohoo! My favorite series. Thank you, Disney, for that one. Going back to DreamWorks now, we have Boo, which again, in talking about all of these cancelled productions, sometimes they just get taken down. It's one of those things, I get it. You want to hold on to the footage that you own, but also aren't going to redistribute. A brilliant Nintendo-esque thing to do that's only going to inquire more eyes on and more pirating, if you ask me. So again, I'll stick to just vague imagery. Boo, or the Bureau of Otherworldly Operations, was going to be all about ghosts. And we had all sorts of visuals and footage clips to bounce off of to really see an interesting display of a story. This seemed like a DreamWorks production that was really well into making progress, and judging by the fact that I got so many suggestions for this movie, I think there was quite a rabid fan base for it as well. Now this movie takes place over the 2009-2012 era of DreamWorks animation, and was certainly a tumultuous time for the crew, which makes me think as well it could have been a real solid solo DreamWorks movie. It doesn't have to spin off into a series and have its own fantastical franchise on top of it. I just think it would have been a really great solo story. In the end, it just got dropped. Jeffrey Katzenberg wasn't a big fan of it, and they removed it in time for Inside Out by Disney and Pixar because, maybe that's a good time to cut your losses, to be fair. Perhaps in comparison, it just wasn't good enough. Add on to the fact that this was during the time with DreamWorks that they had Rise of the Guardians, Mr. Peabody and Sherman, Turbo, and Penguins of Madagascar, all of which were kind of flopped at the box office. I guess it makes sense they wanted to go safer, but every time there looks to be something of genuine passion and artistic prowess that just gets dropped for the sake of business is always gonna feel pretty naff. Instead, in 2015, we got Home, which is, again, a horrible movie to replace with. Always a tragedy. So moving on, we now have the Plants vs. Zombies movie, which I think is really, really interesting. There is very little on the side of footage, but I do remember this great big art piece for the concept art that kind of feels more like the Plants vs. Zombies Garden Warfare game, whereby they sort of animate the characters a lot better. It could have been a simple 2D cartoon in the same esque style of Cuphead, but not 1930s, but trying to reinvent it in a more larger scale, I think it's just a really interesting story. Plants vs. Zombies is an incredible and creative IP, as much as it's 10, 15 years in the past now with mobile gaming coming and going with it. But I think it's a movie I could have really jived with had it actually gotten made. Add on to the fact that the director of this movie was connected to the Lego movie, and it could have been a really fantastical story, again done by DreamWorks. Perhaps it's a little bit unfair of me to say that I fell in love with the 3 pictures there practically are for this movie and running with it so high up this list, but man, I just love video games sometimes, even if it's something as simple as a 2D mobile game I never actually played. Like, look at the concepts with this. A gigantic actual warfare, a cartoony rendition of zombies done in such a creative way, and done by some brilliant crew at a time when DreamWorks is just doing its standard cancelling thing. I don't know, I just really like this. I really wish it got made. It could have been so good. But alas, the whole point of this list anyway is my subjective opinion. You might really wish that Gigantic got ahead of here, but feel free to tell me in the comments how wrong I am. All opinions are valid, let's be honest. It's just about cancelled productions. None of it matters anyway. It didn't exist. Up next, I want to talk about The Mouse Guard. I'm actually kind of surprised I put it this high up on the list, but I think, judging by the fact that there's so much footage and seeing kind of the production that's going on around this movie, this could have been a very, very interesting premise. Now, this was a 20th Century Fox movie, and we have all sorts of visuals to assist with the idea and concept of this movie. It's a pretty simplistic idea. Everybody is mice. It's medieval-esque times. It's a fantasy epic, but just look at the visuals, man. This is some like early day stuff. They're just putting the details together, and I think this could have been a surprise, maybe not like a massive Hollywood success, but it certainly seems like one of those over-the-top crazy artsy productions on the side that you wish got more attention. Now, Mouse Guard as well as a whole is already based on comics that are apparently pretty notoriously enjoyed and beloved in a lot of ways, which of course meant the story would have been absolutely fantastic. So attaching that to the visuals of this movie that I think were just put together with Unreal Engine at the time, and onto the fact that there was some brilliant crew members like Wes Ball on as the director and creators like Andy Serkis and Idris Elba attached, and I think it just could have been a seriously solid, strange spin-off production from not Pixar or Disney, but involved in a way that could have been really enticing, as much as it could have been underrated and what have you. But alas, this one was once again taken down by business acquisition, as Disney had acquired 20th Century Fox in 2019, and thus they disappeared, crushed like the tiny little animals they were. Beyond that, we have Monkeys of Mumbai, also known as Bollywood Superstar Monkey and Mumbai Musical. Now this movie, for some reason, I distinctively remember writing all of the details and putting the imagery together and thumbnailing. I knew exactly what chair I sat on while I wrote the script for this movie, and it just seems like a solid, understandable movie from start to finish. A lot of the story we already knew about. The story follows these 2 orphaned monkey brothers that are dealing with the cards that they've been dealt, as they very much feel the hardship of being street monkeys and scavengers. One's optimistic and one is a lot more pragmatic. And basically the whole plotline is fully detailed as how they go through their trials of running around, avoiding gangs, and dealing with the love of their life and godly monkeys on a film. There's all sorts of story here. And very much the fact that it was inspired by like Bollywood musicals means it also could have been just, again, fantastic for representation and a story that we really hadn't seen before. I can't imagine the impact of a movie like this, and the fact that it's so well rounded in concepting just means I really could see the full vision for this, and I have no idea where the influences could have gone beyond it, but it's just so exciting to have seen something so original and creative being made. made, and this was around like 2014. It was the mid-2010s at this time. So again, far beyond where we are 10 years later, where everything is a sequel and a spin-off and a redo. But alas, it was once again another tax write-off, and that was the end of it. There are, of course, millions and millions of concept arting as well that there is to bounce off of. I just think it just looked pretty great. Like nothing I'd ever really seen before, again done by DreamWorks. It really could have been something special, I feel. And yeah, the representation of all of these different godly figures, it's just so unendingly creative, yet so simple in a monkey storyline. What a disappointment it ever got made. Hello there, it's the halfway mark of the video, so you probably know what's coming up. This is the plug to tell you to subscribe, if you haven't already, and if you haven't, you've got all sorts of other content to follow if you're interested. Do check out our cancelled series playlist, where all of these individual segments have their own expanded 10 to 20 minute videos. I adore lost media content, and I don't know if I'll have necessarily that much longevity to talk about it more, but we've certainly got more rankings coming up as a nice little way to tie a knot on the end of some of these series as I move on to a slightly more different direction on the channel. Nothing too unusual to what we've already done, just new series coming in and new series coming out. We've also actually already done a ranking of terrible movies, but it was a stream. Maybe I'll redo that in commentary form, but if you're interested in knowing ahead of time, there's an option for you too. Either way, thank you for making it halfway through this project. Certainly wasn't easy making halfway through. Let's get over to what is more likely to be the better half of the cancelled movies. And thank you so much for watching this far in. Tell me your list as well over on our Discord server or down in the comments below. Cheers. Alright, we've almost made the final stretch. This next one is another Disney Toon studio production. They made several Pixar sequels at the time, or they were planning to at least. Oh, I meant Circle 7 animation. This one is the Monsters, Inc. sequel. Of course, replacing, because it's before the Monsters, Inc. prequel, Monsters University, the Monsters, Inc. sequel is another one of those productions that we just know the entire timeline of. Instead of focusing on Mike and Sully dealing with university in the before times, Monsters, Inc. 2, Lost in Scaradise, already the marketing's a little bit off there, would have instead followed the two getting trapped in the human world searching for Boo. There'd be all sorts of other monsters along the way, they'd go through all sorts of dimensional doors, like a kind of Spider-Verse, multiverse story, I guess. And also it would have showcased a more mature Boo. Really, it just sounds like the perfect fan fiction. We want to see more of Boo and more of the Dorley world, I guess, making it more action-packed rather than boring factory manual working. But considering the fact that even Monsters at Work never got around to reintroducing Boo means this was very much never the direction Pixar actually wanted to go. But still, the whole thing can be stitched together. And in fact, there are other creators on YouTube that have done a brilliant job essentially reanimating the idea of the whole timeline. And I think this would have been a really interesting direction for things to go. Soon enough, I'm going to make a video about Pixar sequels and where everything can go from here, since clearly that's the direction Pixar wants to take now. And considering the fact that the sequel that they actually went with Monsters at Work feels sometimes a little bit underwhelming, I think it could have been really interesting to see where this version of the sequel could have gone. I'm still pretty happy enough with the franchise of Monsters, Inc. I much prefer Monsters University. It is an underrated classic. And again, the best part is them being trapped in the human world. That's just a brilliant plot piece. So to see it explored better and more intrinsically here is really, really interesting. It's not the end of the world that this Monsters, Inc. sequel didn't get made, but I think with Pixar potentially thinking about how to do Monster, Inc. sequels from now on, I wouldn't be too upset if this was closer to the direction they actually went with. I don't absolutely despise that this weird Circle 7 animation spin-off fanfiction Monsters, Inc. exists, or could have existed. Maybe I'm somewhat weirdly on board, as much as the idea of it all probably makes all of Pixar fall apart at just the thought. Alrighty, we are now at the final top 10 cancelled movies according to me and only me. So with that in mind, let's talk Sly Cooper. Now, I'm really surprised this made it to the top 10, to be honest, because Sly Cooper isn't even a video game series that I played. But the actual movie, damn, it looked pretty decent. I think it's an interesting thing. I think I like video games more for their story than the gameplay these days. I'm really aging up to be a boring old man. But alas, the Sly Cooper film was a real thing going on, and had all sorts of production progress in it, aiming for a release around 2016. Again, a lot of these are the mid-20s for some reason. Is it because that's when we knew about them and they were archived better, or is it because there was a real phase of trying to do original stuff and adaptation? I don't know. Either way, interesting. Now, this is a rare Sony Pictures cancellation, and there were multiple real videos showcasing the vibes of Sly Cooper, full on getting a trailer and everything. Now, of course, this is only early days footage. There would have been all sorts of changes still. I think there's even even changes between the two trailer footages we have. And the actual concept of Sly Cooper as a character just seems like a lot of fun. A sneaky kind of story taking place at night with that fun little weapon and grinding down little wires and vans. I don't know. Just a very basic idea that I think would be quite an interesting movie to see. I'm always on board with a good video game adaptation, and maybe the fact that it's a 2016 one means it's not that great of an adaptation. In fact, actually, that's a good point. There is a very good comparison you can make with this movie, as the 2016 Ratchet & Clank movie was also an influence perhaps behind why this movie got cancelled. You know, the adaptations hadn't quite mastered it yet. That movie was a huge box office failure, and so it made issues along the way. But I do know Sly Cooper has, again, its own rabid niche fan base. The visual aesthetic as well for the cel-shaded actual design of the gameplay, I'm always a big fan of. I love cell damage, I love cell animation. I just love all animation to tell you the truth. But the Sly Cooper movie is one I really could have seen being good. It seemed to have all of the right things going for it. It had a proper hand in the people who actually made the video game involved. Sucker Punch Productions were incorporated with doing it. And then soon enough, everyone just pieced off of it because it just wasn't the way it worked, which is a real shame because I think not necessarily going to say this could have been the start of the great stuff, but it had a lot of potential, which is what you're going to find a lot for these final 10 movies. Maybe, I mean, speaking of that, our very next one is Scoob 2. You know, maybe I should, I think I really put my foot in my mouth for that one. Now, this is one of the newest cancellations in the grand scheme of things, with it being a 2022 movie, and of course being right in the center of Warner Brothers doing its now Warner Brothers thing. Now, Scoob 2 is actually called Scoob Holiday Haunt, and was actually more overshadowed by the fact that they also cancelled Batgirl, but both of these have the same damn problem where I believe they were pretty much fully finished with these movies. It's the same old story as Coyote vs. Acme. Now, to be clear, Scoob, the original movie, isn't really good either. It was meant to be a cinematic universe for Hanna-Barbera characters, and they're in there, but it gets lost along the way. Simon Cowell is in like one of the very first scenes, and he was outdated 20 years ago. But alas, I don't know, I think any kind of cancellation in this form, where it is 90 to 95% done, as is quoted for this movie, is just so black-hearted. I just despise any cancellation being handled by David Zaslav, and even if the production is bad and terrible, release it. I want to make fun of it, man. Like, where's your pride? Forget about your pride. The fact of the matter is, while a lot of cancellations can fall through corporate reshufflings or other corporate reacquisitions, you know, maybe the intention falls off, or unfortunately a member of the cast or the crew dies before production and that halts the whole thing, you know, those are more understandable forms for cancellation. To just cut it off when it is essentially done, and then just take it off as a tax write-off and just do slimy executive things, cutting off as well the passionate artists along the way that have massively pushed for this kind of thing to be produced, like, it's just awful. I don't care how bad the actual movie is, give me Scoob 2. In fact, even just give me the horrendously poorly lit test footage along the way. Now, I don't think Scoob 2 is necessarily the hill to die on. I've already been controversial enough when it comes to the Scoob series, but I do wonder if there is going to be any more Scoob stuff at all anymore, since we haven't heard anything since, but it's only been 2 years. I don't know. It at least visually looks nice as much as it's an absolute fever dream start to finish. Up next in the 8th slot is actually our most recent cancelled episode. It's the cancelled Henry Selick movie. Always a hard way to market this video. I'm not surprised it's underperforming. Either way, this is a surprisingly, I guess, almost uncancelled movie. This is a Laika production movie. A very rare Laika cancellation, being helmed by the director behind Nightmare Before Christmas and Coraline. This could have been a damn good movie. It's stop motion, it's creepy, it's beautiful. But what makes this even more exciting, and a movie I absolutely would have loved to have seen, is the fact that it's not just a Laika movie. In fact, in the early days, it wasn't even going to be Laika working on it. It was the same director, but it was going to be handled over at Pixar instead. Can you imagine that? A Pixar movie in a stop-motion format. If that released, no matter how good or bad it was, although it probably would have been good because the director of Coraline's involved, like, that could have expanded so far into its own cone of spin-offs and direction and departments for Pixar. Pixar already was pushing for the front of 3D CGI animation. Can you imagine if they ended up reviving and really platforming on the largest stage that animation really had at the time, stop motion as well? Like, it's an incredible loss that this didn't get made, beyond the fact that it disappointed a single guy. Even just from a cultural perspective, I just think that could have been so good for animation, so interesting as a concept. And then you get to the actual concept, the Shadow King, or at one point, Shade Maker. It's all about a child who has deformed hands and really long fingers, and they deal with shadowy things. They meet a mysterious girl who teaches them to do hand puppets, and they end up having to defend the world against the war with the Shadow Realm. And it's it's gonna be classic creepy Coraline-y things, but also, God, it just sounds so fascinating. Pixar and Laika together, intermixed. And the reason it cancelled is because John Lasseter didn't like it. He kept apparently trying to Disney-fy it along the way. It ballooned the budget, and they didn't want to spend any money on it. Despite the fact that stop motion has some of the longest longevity for animated productions, we still talk about Nightmare Before Christmas and Coraline, and they are so old at this point. I'm sorry, it's true if you check to the years they came out. That I do think this was a colossal loss from a business animation perspective. But hey, at least Henry Selick got to go on and make other things instead. They seem pretty great, at least from the visuals I've seen, and the Shadow King's getting a graphic novel now, so maybe someone else will adapt it over time. If you want to see the full details about that movie, check out the video on that one specifically, since it underperformed, so, you know. Yeah. Keeping up with the theme of Pixar, we then have Pixar's one main frontliner cancelled production. We've talked about Pixar spin-offs being cancelled, or Pixar side projects being cancelled, but this is an outright Pixar started a movie, they hid them in Easter eggs in several movies, and then they got deleted along the way. This is Pixar's Newt. Getting a cameo appearance in both Brave and Toy Story 3, the Pixar Newt movie just didn't get made, and I think that still, in its own way, could have been really fascinating. I'm a big fan of Pixar, of course I am. Every Pixar movie is so much of an interesting banger, and this is an animal-based Pixar movie. There's some that already exist, sure, but they're mostly fish, bugs, and rodents. To see a reptile actually represented is, different, interesting. I think it could have been really good. The actual story about it as well, being more like a science lab lizard that gets out to the wild, maybe has been done before, but I think it just could have been a lot of fun that I really just would have loved to have seen. I think the thing really holding it up for me is the fact that it's a Pixar main front runner, but it also doesn't seem like it was cancelled because of test audiences not liking it or anything like that. Instead, it's really surmised that it was deleted by Pete Docter, as he ended up being past the project and then decided to run with his own project, Inside Out, instead. And to be fair, makes sense. He maybe was right on that front. It's currently blowing up the box office in the sequel form, so there you are. Still, what's also a bit of a shame with this is, much like Henry Selick, it has a particular person at the center of it that really sort of boosts the desire that it actually came out, as this is a Gary Rydstrom production, or it would have been at least their first. Now, this would have been his full-length feature film directorial debut, and it didn't happen. Which is a shame, because they have all sorts of Academy Awards and were clearly an incredibly powerful, expert person getting their step one, and then it fell from beneath them, despite as well working for Pixar for many, many years. They did eventually get to direct a feature-length film in the form of Strange Magic, which maybe is not the best ending, eh? For number 6 on our list, we have then the very next Lego movie. Technically, it already exists now, the Lego Movie 3. I'm not talking about Lego Ninjago, I'm not talking about Lego Batman, and I'm not talking about Piece by Piece, the biopic about Pharrell Williams. No, Lego Movie 3 was an initial, actual third movie, actually more akin to the likes of Ninjago and Batman in the fact that it is kind of a side spin-off. It's not actually part of the Lego Movie, and the sequel Lego Movie. But what I found invariably interesting about this is the fact that this was more of a racing movie. Maybe not so much an integral part of Lego, but in my mind very much fits the bill, as it's kind of that Hot Wheels Venn diagram lapover. Actually being titled as the Billion Brick Race, there is once again all sorts of concept art for some of these storyboards and all sorts of characters they were going to introduce, and I think it just could have been a really cool, I don't want to say cyberpunk, I don't know what kind of punk I want to say here, but a very Mad Maxian, sure, we'll say a Mad Maxian style story that is just a brilliant, sensical expansion for the Lego universe. And that was part of the intention, with some of the creators of this movie saying they wanted to reinvent the Lego world. I think both Ninjago and Lego Batman do a great job of expanding their little universes in that side of Lego, and this is just an understandable next expansion beyond it. Visually, I think it looks astounding, the concepts look brilliant. The story we don't actually know a lot of details about, but I mean, you could see it enough. A big, fantastical Lego race. The quintessential storyline for when you're playing with toys as a little boy with Lego wheels that actually wheel around. I think this could have been a really nice revival of the Lego franchise that was kind of flubbing around this point. It's a bit of a shame that Lord and Miller themselves weren't involved, so it wouldn't have that frenetic, eclectic, incredibly fast-paced actual screenplay writing, but judging on just the racing action scenes of the Lego movie alone and how crazy the spinning cameras and the animations and the motion blur and all those attention details to are, imagining that for a full movie just sounds fantastic. Ultimately though, the deal between Universal Pictures and the Lego Group and their 5-year exclusive deal to make movies crushed this movie, and it never came out. I really could have looked forward to this movie. I much prefer it over a damn another celebrity talking about themselves for 2 hours. Alright, now that we've had a nice break with Lego Movie, let's get right back to Pixar. What a surprise! I really like the idea of Pixar movies coming back, although to be fair, one of our bottom ones is the Toy Story sequel. This is very much the cancelled Disney Cars spin-off. Once again being run by Disney Toon Studios. We've had cars, we've had car spies, we've had planes. What's left but none other than trains? But instead of just calling it Trains, which honestly probably would have been more successful on the marketing, this was instead going to be called Metro. And you know what? That's pretty good too. This is another one of those movies that has so much concept art running with it that you can practically piece the whole movie together, and visually, even just in sketch form, it looks pretty damn brilliant. Good enough that you can really put together a headcanon of how the world of trains would work in universe, because we don't actually see that many trains in the Cars franchise. One almost runs over the plane in Planes, and one helps evacuate people in Planes too. That's the extent of my knowledge of planes in Cars. God, that's a weird sentence to say. Regardless, what expands this more than just the fact of it being cars but trains is the fact that it's actually more intertwined with previous movies, which are a really interesting direction to take storytelling for kids animation, as they were going to be based off of 2 similar-esque gangster movies set in New York. Instead, more so being a plotline about this one tiny little train trying to run through all of New York to get to a certain island while being chased by gang members. It was going to be a grungy sort of story, which very much fits with the underground grungy tone of underground train tracks. There's a very easy pitfall with the idea of a Trains movie, that there's just not really very much mobility. They have to follow the track. So for with it being a chase on a singular track with a little bit of diversion because it's a city, is probably the best you can do, and it genuinely really hooked me in. Add on to the fact that there's so much nice expansions with the Trains universe. We can see all sorts of Mad Maxian aesthetics once again, but also you see how trains relax. They all go to a sort of pub place together. There's all sorts of puns and interesting architecture around the city of this metro city land, and the reinterpretation of famous places like the New York train station is just really fascinating to see. I think with it being such a simple idea but turned into a really unique and interesting story, this could have been genuinely a really good movie, and it's a surprise that it's coming from Disney Toons Studios of anything else. If anything, I wouldn't be too upset if Pixar mainline tried to take on more Cars content by taking the idea of this initial Metro movie. Everyone I've heard so far from the comments of that initial cancelled episode we did seemed to really like the idea of this movie, as far as I can tell. Why not do it, you know? Of course, maybe there are more movies like Planes 2 Fire and Rescue that are a little bit more important to teach kids about, and less of the grungy gangster crime, but I don't know, I really liked this. In a lot of ways, I'm kind of disappointed it didn't get made. I'm glad Disney Toon Studios shut down in 2018, but also, oh, what a movie it could have been. It could have been. Maybe the version in my head will always be better than the final output. Oh well. Alright, we forgot about him for a while. Let's talk about David Zaslav again. We're only covering, obviously, the animated movies in this cancelled ranking, and of course the stuff I actually know about and have covered, so we're not going to talk about Batgirl, but we are going to talk about Warner Brothers' David Zaslav's fumble that is Coyote vs. Acme. I don't need to tell you the ramble again, but bloody hell is this the most frustrating project in the world, and I am honestly astounded that it hasn't been leaked yet. To cancel a production that not only this time is 100% done, it's not 90 to 95 like Scoob 2, but the fact that it's also practically a movie that is brilliant in quality as well. The fact that there are several actual directors and mainline experts in the franchise who have seen this movie in some sort of premiere preview, I can't remember what it was exactly, and they say, bloody hell, this was brilliant. It is mind-blowing that they actually dropped what it could have been. It is a fantastic movie. It is there. It is ready. Who cares about your minimal 8-digit tax write-off? You make 9 to 10 digits yearly. It's such an injustice that it has been lost to time. It is at this point a moral obligation to release this movie, leak it, and then pirate it as far as you can. Because this is the slimiest business executive decision you can make. And honestly, I think it's going to be the stain on David Zaslav's career that'll really emblemate his reputation. I already wasn't a fan of the guy after past cancellations and all sorts of weird Warner Brothers things and Warner Brothers Discovery. Look what they did to my boy Smash Brothers the ripoff. And honestly, even then, that's modern problems. To then delete Batgirl and Scoob 2, sure, and Coyote vs. Acme, I just do not trust Warner Brothers to release anything anymore. Even though they are, Looney Tunes movies are here now. But I mean, this one was a Looney Tunes movie as well, so we'll see. Add on to the fact that it's taking away creatives as well. Of course, you've got the point that all of the people involved with Coyote vs. Acme are just infuriated that this has been disintegrated on a whim, if not just endlessly depressed about the whole thing. But also the fact that you are pushing away other future creatives to come to your studio, and I say good! Good riddance. Warner Brothers as well has done. That's what I originally boycotted them for, is because of the whole Ezra Miller thing, being invited to watch the premiere of The Flash. This is the most morally bankrupt studio of modern times. This isn't like I wish this movie came out 20 years ago. This is a 2022 movie. I'm not even sure about that. It's 2023. It's the newest one, and I'm just... It doesn't help that Wile E. Coyote is also my personal favorite Looney Tunes character. If I was to say any criticism, it's a bit of a shame that they're 2D in the real-life world, but also, that's the style they were in originally, so if anything, it's more artistically intrinsic than what I would want to imagine with the 3D fun version of that short that they have of Coyote that looks really, really good. Forget about it, I don't even know art good enough. This movie is beyond me and my personal little criticisms and complaints and praises and reviews. This movie, in the very fourth slot of the cancel movie I want to see the most, is the one that, of course, makes my blood boil. I want this movie so badly. And it's the fact that it's so close. It's so there. Maybe someone will release it, but they're finding the right time. Maybe they're waiting for the anniversary. They're waiting for a Christmas project. I don't know. Maybe a thief will run in and find the Warner Brothers vaults and steal Oni Coyote. That'd be quite the story. Is that how that works? I don't think that's how that works. I guess it would be on some hard drive anywhere, but this is the biggest shame out of everything. The other future movies may have bigger praises of, wow, could you imagine what a great movie it could have been? But this is, what a shame. I can't believe they've done this from a business perspective instead. This is a movie infueled with negativity for the way it was handled and the way it was cancelled. If we could go to parallel universes for anything in the world, it's this movie right here. Just to calm down the angry soul that is embedded within me now from this movie. But hey, let's get to the nicer things now, shall we? It's the top 3 cancelled movies. And we're pulling it off first with the other rare Sony production cancellation. It is the Popeye movie. Now, Sony as well is a studio that's very much had its ups and downs, but when it's specifically being involved with Genndy Tartakovsky, it makes some of the greatest stuff. Hotel Transylvania, of course, is just written for 4-year-olds and plot-wise it's absolutely awful, but the animation, the actual stylistic choices around it are absolutely fabulous, and Popeye was the 2016 rendition of that. Now, we have all sorts of footage around this movie that just looks brilliant. Look at it. Apparently, there were all sorts of criticisms at the time about the fact that the 3D was very jarring compared to the initial 2D cartoon, and obviously it was a lot more underappreciated back in the day, but nowadays, looking at this, I just think this looks bloody well brilliant. I also am just a schmuck that prefers 3D over 2D. Sue me. I know you do too. You click on 3D thumbnails more than 2D. My data analytics say so. But even so, to revive an old cartoon that otherwise isn't really in the media zeitgeist would have been a great thing to see. And I love Sony when they do Sony things well. When they're not emoji moving around everywhere, this really looks like it could have been a starring production. And considering its sidekick's sister production was the likes of the Angry Birds movie, I think this could have just been the better outcome. In the end, it was cancelled due to creative differences, and apparently as well the 2014 Sony hack contributed to all of this. And also, looking back at the articles about this movie, I think more stuff has since come out, as I'm seeing all sorts of artwork that I don't remember necessarily putting into the actual video. I could be wrong on that, maybe I was lazy at the time, it was a very different me, it was a long time ago. What's also especially a shame is the actual video I made about this put on as a thumbnail uncancelled, as there was a time when it seemed like it had been released a little bit. I still don't think that's a thing anymore. I think it has been re-cancelled. Don't believe the thumbnail, kids, I'm sorry. News, you know, these things get a little bit messy. People love flip-flopping on this kind of thing. Even still, a big old animatic as well has released for Popeye that apparently appeared and then was shut down and then appeared on Vimeo. I probably can't show you for the sake of I don't want to get in too much trouble. Honestly, the fact that I'm bringing out this video that's going to be like 50 minutes long is already going to be scary. I got to make sure I don't upset anybody, because one person gets upset, the whole damn thing disappears. You saw what I had to do to the Peanuts 2 movie. Even still, I think this could have been really brilliant. I think at this point of the list, the things I really want to see are just my style of movies at this point. I can start being cherry picking, and the Sony Pictures slapstick over-the-top cartoony vibes of that Hotel Transylvania aesthetic with Gendry Tartakovsky involved is just my kind of movie. This is the movie I would have loved to have seen some of the most of, because it's just so visually me. From like the 45 seconds we have of footage from the main teaser of this project, it has so many jokes and elements and interesting creative decisions and choices. It just looks like for a full 90-minute romp, let alone 2 hours, it could have just been so fantastical start to finish. And maybe something more original could have taken its place, and I mean, it did in the form of Hotel Transylvania, I guess. Being able to revive something that has otherwise been lost and is collecting dust, maybe in a nice way, is a good way of revitalizing and bringing new life into something in a positive matter, with real passion and artwork put behind it, rather than just corporate reshilling and beating a dead horse until it starts walking again, you know? That's not how the phrase goes, but I'm saying it anyway. Regardless, Gendry Tartakovsky has gone on to do other things, I guess, that were, if you ask me, a little bit more underwhelming, but that's fine. If I could have picked how the timeline went, I really would have loved this movie to be made, just to see where it could have gone from there, or just as a single off-piece thing. The Tartakovsky career direction isn't really one I've been too on board with Hotel Transylvania getting diminishing returns, not even on profits, but just from quality is just like a disappointment. I feel like it's almost a wasted talent at this point, and Popeye could have been a really good other output instead for that kind of talent. It's what it is, it's just talent. Following that, as our runner-up, we have the best case scenario for a cancelled episode, the one that really deserved the uncancelled thumbnail. It is, of course, Blue Sky Studios' Nimona. Now, yes, it is a shame to say that technically it is still cancelled in the sense that it, isn't being made by Blue Sky Studios anymore, with them imploding in 2021. But really, of course, what I liked about this project initially is the fact that it could have been a really nice, influential story, since it had such clear LGBT themes intertwined with it, essentially being the blended rendition of a Tumblr account and culture being blended down into a comic and a novel that then becomes a movie. And I just think that being able to tell stories like that is a brilliant new sense of representation and diversity that are important to tell. If you don't like it, then watch the plain stuff. That's fine. It's just like food. If you want to be plain, feel free to eat plain. You don't have to eat salt, but, that's your choice. Regardless, starting as a webcomic, it does eventually have the best case scenario in the fact that it was revived, going to Netflix of all places, one of probably the best platforms you can really get for eyes on if it's not a theatrical release anyway. Add on to the fact that it had some brilliant casting with Chloe Grace Moretz or even Eugene Lee Yang, and I think it really did get the best case scenario. In the fact that it finally got out there, it told new stories, it platformed new creatives, both in the cast and in the crew, and of course it won all sorts of awards. And the actual end result is pretty damn good. The fact of the matter is, I got to sit down on a lovely couch, watch it start to finish with a giant gleeful smile on my face. At the time, it was one of those movies that I was most intensely interested in actually seeing, and hey-ho, it actually happened, and damn was it a good final output as well. I'm sure with all the past movies we've talked about up to this point leading to this final one here, a lot of these movies maybe were good that they didn't come out, in the fact that maybe they would have been terrible, maybe they would have influenced us in the wrong direction, maybe they would have span off into all the more sequels and franchises that we didn't really need with not the mainline studio involved. But Nimona right here had a goal, it one way or another eventually got there, and damn has it made an impact. The likes of which we might not even feel for a good few years from now, but I'm just so damn glad it got to the damn goalpost by the end anyway. And finally, of course, we come to the very best, the pinnacle of cancelled productions, not being so negatively angry that I want to scream at the fact that it didn't exist, but also it has such a high priority for the just fact of how high the potential could have been for this movie. This is, of course, DreamWorks' Me and My Shadow. At one time just called Shadows, being helmed by Edgar Wright, this movie just seems like the most creative, artsy masterclass of a production had it actually gotten made. You likely already know about this movie. If you clicked on this video, you likely clicked on my other one about this movie first. It's the only cancelled movie I've made multiple videos of, and honestly, I could make a third considering there is even more footage that has since released. Me and My Shadow follows this nerdy little guy named Stanley who has a menial factory job at a light bulb factory, and his shadow is alive and conscious and the opposite of the introverted, shy nature of his human body form. This would have been a brilliant mix, just the ultimate artsy animation prowess of finding a brilliant way to hybrid 3D CGI animation and 2D shadow work as well. From that point alone, I am already sold. Of course, there have been all sorts of other CGI 2D hybrids like Treasure Planet, you know. It's a flop in its own right, I see what's going on, would have been great as a series, you heard all that before already. But this would have been an even more interesting way to do it, whereby the 2D is the thing spicing up the story rather than the 3D that can now stronghold the story animation. Now, the mixing of 2D, 3D nowadays we have in its different form with Mitchells vs. Machines adding this more note form overlay instead, but this story alone, forgetting even going into the plot line, which we will soon, is just so fantastically done. But I guess one of the many hurdles as well is the fact of actually putting together a department, especially these days, to do both traditional animation and 3D stuff. These days, the only ones doing traditional animation anymore are the tiny indie studios or Japan and anime. And it's a real shame as well. Beyond that though, the visuals, or at least the concepting art we have, are just absolutely brilliant. The very idea of shadows with a legitimate lighting source allows for so many more creative things to be done, whether it is gigantic shadows cast, or the very fact that Stanley thematically works at a lighthouse factory. You've then got the aspect that they expand into a shadow world being visible. If a shadow is locked into a blocked, shadowy wall, they disappear and fall into the shadow realm, where we see everyone has a shadow that's conscious, and they're just not allowed to talk to their biological feet connection. That's not the canon description for the relationship between the two, but never mind, don't worry about it. Then add on to the fact that during this production hell development, it was then passed on to Edgar Wright, and you can only imagine the crazy places that would have gone. I think the next best comparison you can really think about is maybe Last Night in Soho, where there's a little bit of that going through the floor element of what could have been the shadow realm. I'm again still really disappointed in the fact that I was literally in the room with Edgar Wright once and was standing outside said room with the opportunity to talk to him, and my introverted, sweaty brain didn't even think about asking him about shadows until several months later. God damn it, if I see him again this August, I'll be going to the same festival. Maybe I'll bring it up finally, we'll see. But still, even without even going into all of the plot details, there is just so much creatively you could do here. And I think from DreamWorks, the biggest flop is the fact that not only did it not get made and blow up conceptually, because everyone I've told about this movie, including everyone that's witnessed that initial movie, seems so on board. Like, it seems like it markets itself. Honestly, what a flub, what a fumble. But I easily think this could have expanded into a franchise. Me and My Shadow 2 could do all sorts of things, whether it is more Stanley and Dan collaborations and relationships, or just anybody. You could almost Cars universe this with all sorts of different people, all sorts of different relationship variations. You can do so much more with the shadow world. You could do so much more with the concept of lighting. Literally everything about this universe is so fascinating. I can just imagine more like I'm kind of thinking of the Roger Rabbit thing again, with the headlamp in the ceiling just swinging back and forth. That alone does so much. What if someone's on a submarine? Where does the shadow work around with that? I don't know. There's just so much I can't even fathom to explain with such an unendingly creative idea. Stanley might have been at one point Josh Gad, and maybe that's a little bit of a blip along the way if you're not a Josh Gad fan. But really, I think this is the biggest blunder in animation history, and it's so sad that there's not even been a murmur of bringing it back. Instead, the movie has apparently just been planted back into development and has been in limbo ever since, getting its initial slot replaced by Mr. Peabody and Sherman. And then beyond that, nobody, at least on the professional stage, ever really talks about it again. This, by far, is easily my favorite cancelled movie, and if I could ever randomly build up $100 million, this is probably where I'd spend it. Whether that would allow me to afford the payslip of Edgar Wright, I have no idea, but even anybody involved with this concept can do so many incredible things. And DreamWorks know how to make a good cancelled movie, since they have all sorts of prompts scattered all across this ranking system. Some we already got, and this one was by far the best ranking movie of all the animated cancelled productions, at least that we've covered so far. Our cancelled series is probably still gonna truck on for a little bit. There are all sorts of franchise expansions that exist out there. I've already got a couple that are already recorded and all that. But otherwise, that is our full ranking of every cancelled movie ever. And on that note, I shall end things off there. My name's been Daz, thank you very much for reaching the end of this list. Do let us know your list of all of your thoughts on the cancelled productions down in the comments, or on our Discord server, and do check out our cancelled playlist if you want to get deep dive production details about any of them. Any opportunity to talk about lost media, clearly I'm very invested in, and boy howdy have I spent a lot of minutes talking about it. Both across the last 4 years, and also this video alone. The recording is 1 hour and 42 minutes. Yikes, I can't wait to edit this. But after all of that, I shall see you in a little bit.